athletics reported to me from roughly about 2004 to about 2006, about 2.5 years. And when I had responsibility for it, and of course I had involvement with athletics over a much longer period of time under report to me for those 2.5 years, they were having difficult budget problems at that time. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. When I retired, I went to Paris for a year with my wife, which was a phenomenal experience, highly recommended. Live in another country for a long time is a good thing to do. So when I came back, this, however you want to describe it, the brouhaha over intercollegiate athletics was underway. Faculty Senate proposed a resolution. It was in the context of the most significant financial crisis in the history of the university, without any question. I think that's important because I think you need an absolute crisis in order to affect any significant change in intercollegiate athletics. It's not terribly different even from major social issues that eventually lead to change. So I thought, gee, I've really got to understand this. When I had athletics, which I think is very typical for people in my position, you kind of inherit these jobs. And a lot of people who inherit them don't know very much about them, don't know very much about athletics. So you have to rely on the athletic director, basically, to provide you with the information that you need. Typically, you have a host of other responsibilities as well, as the current Vice Chancellor does, who now has this responsibility. So you're kind of taking this on the fly and doing the best you can with it. That's not always the case, but in the vast majority of cases, I think that's true. So I came back and I thought, I really have to understand this. I mean, it's one of these issues that is continually confounding when you're working at a university in a management position at a big university with big time sports. And so I thought, okay, I'm really going to look into this. And I began by doing some reading, as you would imagine, and there's a very good book that describes where Cal was up to about 1960. It was written, interestingly, by Glenn Seaborg, who was a Nobel Prize winner here, and Ray Colvig, who was the public affairs officer, the spokesperson for the campus for many years. It's an extremely detailed book because Seaborg had a diary, and he literally wrote in that diary every day, virtually, for his entire life. Just a little bit, little notations day by day, but he never missed a day. So, and also had a very good memory. So it's a very detailed book. It's not a bestseller by any means, but if you're interested in this topic, it's very good. So I thought, okay, I'll start from the end of that book, from the 1960s, and go forward. And of course, I had to. I thought I'll interview the key actors, many of whom I knew, the athletic director, the athletic directors, I should say, the director of the recreational sports programs that I hope you're all participating in at Rec Sports, faculty members that had concerns about this, chancellors, vice chancellors, the former chancellor at UCLA, who was chancellor there for 29 years as a comparison. So in the process of doing this, I talked to the director of the Bancroft Library, Charles Fallhaber, and I said, I'm tape recording these interviews. I don't know if you have any interest in this, because they have a very extensive oral history program at the Bancroft Library. And so he said, oh, absolutely, and I'll cover the cost of the transcriptions, which was enormous for me. Otherwise, this would have taken me the rest of my life, assuming I lived to 100 or something like that. So I started reading, and a lot of the material, in terms of the history, was new to me. So what I thought I would do today is give you a sense of what I learned in terms of what I think are basic principles or basic knowledge about the history of intercollegiate athletics that relates to the current day and why that's important, okay? So the first point I want to make is that intercollegiate athletics, the history describes the first intercollegiate athletic event as a crew race in 1852 between Harvard and Yale. And it was sponsored by a railroad company, the Boston, Concord, and Montreal Railroad, and a resort owner in New Hampshire on Lake Winnipesaukee. And he approached somebody at Harvard, I guess one of the students, because this intercollegiate athletics was strictly, it's a very important point, an extracurricular activity, and said, would you guys come up and crew have a race, because we think that would draw people to the resort. And they agreed, and they had all their expenses paid at the resort for a week, which was a very nice deal for them. So right at the beginning of intercollegiate athletics, you have a question of commercialism and that remains up until the very present day, so not new. The concept of intercollegiate athletics was adopted by Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and this is from about 1850 to talking about the first third of the history of intercollegiate athletics, and they were called the Big Three, and Harvard was the best university in the United States, and so they took the lead vis-a-vis intercollegiate athletics. And by Harvard, again, I want to stress, I mean the students. This did not involve faculty or administrators at the outset. But faculty would become involved when football, in particular, or a version of football, rugby, was being played. So at Harvard, for example, it wasn't an intercollegiate contest, but in 1860, I believe there was a kind of a hazing ceremony that had been going on for some time called Bloody Monday. And this was an effort by the sophomore class to initiate the freshmen. And it was quite a bloody event, and it was a version of football, but very rarely did the freshmen win, and they were generally clobbered, and several of them were hurt. So finally, the faculty said, enough of this, we can't have this, and they stopped that practice. The involvement of faculty at these various universities was not terribly effective because the students believed that this extracurricular activity was theirs. It belonged to them. It was a way for them to relax, to kind of vent from their, quote, difficult studies. And it was a tug of war constantly between the faculty, the students, and to some degree the administration. So in the around 1885 or so, there was a first effort to reform intercollegiate athletics, and that was led by the president at Harvard, Charles Eliot. And the issues of concern are the same issues that we're dealing with today. One was eligibility. Who should be able to play these sports? Because what was happening was that at various of these schools, it was not unusual, for example, to put an ad in the newspaper and say, we're looking for a quarterback for our football team. If they could identify a person, then they worried about how that person would be admitted to the university. If they couldn't get in through the regular route, when law schools were just developing at this time, and they were happy to take kind of whoever came along. And so the quarterback would play, would be admitted through the law school, would play, and then he would just leave the university. It was also not uncommon for a player to play for two different teams during the same season. So different colleges, you just go down the way and play for another college. There were also people that played professionally that would come back. There were graduate students that played, etc. And the rules were essentially had to be made by students at the various universities who were playing against each other. And they weren't having much success. So anyway, Elliott stepped in principally, I think, because football was becoming more and more problematic. People were dying on the football field in significant numbers. There were, of course, the equipment was very poor, as you can imagine, in those days. They didn't have a forward pass, for example, so it was a lot of brute force being exercised against two lines. And one of the inventions to win was what was called a flying wedge. So the way this worked was you would have somewhat of a line of scrimmage. It wasn't exactly what we have today. But if you're on the offense, they would set up a wedge of linemen. And the one person would take the ball, and this wedge would focus on one person on the defensive line and smash through that person. They were also known to throw people through the air, too. They also used their bare fists to smash people with their elbows. So you can imagine what the situation was like. So by 1905, the situation, is completely out of control. Grover Cleveland. It's interesting how the sports is so important, valued in the United States, that from time to time the president of the United States gets involved. So in 1894, one of the games at the time was the Army-Navy game. And so many Navy cadets got hurt in the game that Grover Cleveland suspended it for the next few years because something like 24 had to be hospitalized and 60 missed their training and maneuvers because they were too injured to participate. So there's now a major public outcry, and Teddy Roosevelt is the president. Now, Roosevelt was an alum of Harvard, and he was very upset with Charles Eliot for pushing the banning of football. So here's the president of Harvard, who clearly is a very strong reformer, beginning in the mid-1880s, and Roosevelt is quite upset with him and says, before he becomes president, he's talking to Walter Camp, who I should say is the founder of football in the United States, a very prominent figure at Yale University. And he writes a letter and he says, I'm really opposed to banning football. He said, I just hope that even if the brutality and the injuries continue, I would not want to ban football, because football is very important for manliness and virility. Colleges were looked upon as effete. There was a great concern as a result of a great movement of people from agrarian to urban areas about being strong and manly and virile. And there was an incredible debate at Harvard involving William James and Santana and other philosophers, and there's a great book I brought along to bring to your attention called Manhood at Harvard, which is, it's hard to understand today reading this book, but it was certainly a reality. So anyway, Teddy Roosevelt convenes a meeting with Harvard, Yale, and Princeton because, again, of several deaths that occurred on the football field. And the public outcry was enormous. And so he said something has to be done about this. But instead of inviting the president of Harvard, whom you would think he would invite, certainly the president would have been invited today, or the chancellor, by the president of the United States, he invited the football coach, Reed, who, by the way, whose salary was equal to the president of Harvard in 1905. So I think you're getting the picture here about things not being terribly different today than they were in 1905. So that begins the creation of the NCAA. It was called something different at that point in time, the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States, I think, and then that changed to the National Collegiate Athletic Association in 1910. The important thing to remember about the NCAA is a fundamental principle that they adopted at the time, which is called home rule. That means that the NCAA will advise, they will recommend, they will set out principles, which they did, and the principles are still very similar to today about students being amateurs, they can't be compensated, they were against any form of athletic scholarship because that would set athletes aside. They were against admitting athletes, giving any preference to athletes in terms of admission. They had to be part of the regular student body. They were against payment of coaches. Coaches really were paid probably beginning in the late 1800s is when that started. The other, as I said, the coaches before that time were, students. So these were the same kinds of issues that existed today. Let me just read a section here because I don't want to miss the kinds of concerns. So this actually goes back to the Harvard Athletic Committee in the 1880s, that Elliott's no games against non-college teams, a 4-year limit on athletic eligibility. I have a little story about that too. Now, what they could not get was, they convened 7 institutions at that time. They couldn't get agreement on the 7 institutions. So when the NCAA is formed in 1910, they can't get any agreement either. They know they'll never get the agreement, and so they adopt this home rule policy, which exists to this day. So if you want to pass significant reform legislation, it requires a vote of the membership. And they've changed the membership a little bit now, but it's still very much an advisory operation. So they do make some reforms. They improve the equipment. The number of deaths is reduced. And one of the continuing problems was the payment of athletes, and this goes way back to the most recent case, the big case, was Reggie Bush being paid a lot of money, and Cam Newton's father trying to arrange a payment for him. But this goes way back. I mean, into the 1800s. They would pay people to come and play various sports. So there were great efforts made to stop this. Some institutions adopted the principles, and a lot of institutions didn't. And so as a result, of course, they were very quiet about how they were breaking the rules, but eventually it would come to light. There were various reform efforts along the way. There was one in 1929 that the American Council on Education did, and all these reform efforts and papers and things, they all basically say the same thing, that intercollegiate athletics is out of control. We've got to get this back in control. We've got to return to the value of amateur sports, et cetera, et cetera. But it simply doesn't have an impact. The question is, very good question is, why not? Why doesn't it have an impact? And this book, which is a book by Murray Sperber that just preceded his book on beer and circus, is called Onward to Victory. And he talks about the kind of collusion between the media, politicians, universities, colleges, etc., in terms of maintaining college sports. It was important to the towns in which these teams were located. It was a part of their economy. Just saw, I'm sure, in the paper the impact of Calumet playing here this year and playing over in AT&T Park. So again, very similar kinds of issues. The sports reporters were often supporters of the whatever program they reported on. It was to their advantage to do it. It gave them a job. You're not going to get reporters writing frequently of a critical nature if it's going to affect their job. So in a discussion I just had with Murray Sperber yesterday, he's from Indiana University, and he said the local paper in Bloomington never wrote a negative story about Bobby Knight, the basketball coach. So in order to find out what was going on, you had to read the Chicago Tribune, because the editor of the sports page was a good friend of Bobby Knight. So amazing how this persists. And of course, when you think about it, sports, every day in the newspaper there's a section specifically on sports, just like there is on business, and lots of people read it, and lots of people love sports, and lots of people are willing to pay money, more and more money, to go to games and to support these efforts. So let me take a quick second here to make sure that I haven't missed any key points before we get to Berkeley. There have been periods in the history, particularly during world wars, World War I and World War II, where people thought, I wonder if intercollegiate athletics is going to survive, for the obvious reason that a lot of young people were going off to war. It was harder for colleges to put together a team, etc. Again, to make a connection to the federal government, this is during the Second World War, and it involves West Point Army. They had a famous coach named Red Blake, and recruiting had become a much more sophisticated operation by that time. So he was known for recruiting players who had already played at other colleges and universities under the guise that they were coming to West Point to get a commission in the Army. And obviously, some of these people were all Americans from other schools, and the Army was, very terrific. I mean, they 3 deep, they could put together a team that would beat most any other team. So Roosevelt, Nonsense Franklin, FDR, said was getting a lot of complaints because schools were saying this is cheating and we're not going to play Army, and we're just not going to do it. So he said, okay, you've got to stop this practice. And so they stopped for a while until we entered the World War II. And Blake went back to Roosevelt and he said, if you really want to get people to enlist in the Army, the best way to do that is to have a winning football team. And in order to get a winning football team, we should go back and be able to recruit the way we were doing before. So Roosevelt said, okay, go ahead and do it. When I read that, I thought, geez, I thought I had read everything about sports, So, however, it's interesting when you think about this speech that President Obama is going to give tonight. What was one of his major concerns? Not interfering with the NFL game that's on. I mean, so he scheduled his speech to make sure that people could. Okay, so I think that makes that point. So in 1951, in the 50s, there were significant scandals that emerged. Basketball had become a major college sport by that time. And I've been told by several of the ADs that I've interviewed that basketball today is still the most corrupt of all the sports, of all the intercollegiate athletic sports.
ADs being athletic directors.
Athletic directors. And in 1951, Again, reminiscent of that first crew race in 1852, basketball players in the New York area playing for colleges and universities, over the summer they would go to the Catskill resorts and they would play in leagues, again, to draw people to the resorts. And by this time, and it's certainly not true just at that time, it was a magnet for gamblers. There were lots of money because the people who visited these resorts, etc. So it became easy for the gamblers who, I can't remember when the setting of odds came in terms of gambling, but assigning points in terms of determining odds for betting. And they approached players. The principal violators were players from Kentucky, Long Island University, and City College of New York. And this was a huge scandal at that point in time. Somebody blew the whistle on them, and it led to players being hauled away in handcuffs and on and on. A very, very big deal. So I'm glad there's an older crowd here as well as young people. Maybe some of you remember that. But anyway, that was one of these scandals. Interestingly, which again is a pattern, the coaches who were fully knowledgeable about this simply denied it. They said, oh, we didn't know that this was going on. We didn't know that our players were receiving money and that these games were fixed and on and on. We would never tolerate this if we knew about it. Well, it was almost impossible for them not to know about it. They were very involved with these leagues in the Catskills, etc., but they never paid a price. So another recent example of that is Pete Carroll, the coach at USC. They're hit with violations. Carroll leaves and goes and coaches the Seattle Seahawks and just kind of skates on that issue. So again, this kind of continuing pattern of nothing being terribly new. There was that scandal. There was also a scandal at West Point, same year, where the Red Blake had tutors who would help the football players with their classes. And soon these tutors were getting crib sheets, and that was helping them to succeed. So one of the players, again, blew the whistle. That led to a major investigation, a shock to the nation that West Point would participate in anything like this. Red Blake, again, maintained had no knowledge of this whatsoever, never suffered as a result, but a large number of football players were expelled as a result of that. Then in our own conference, which was called the Pacific Coast Conference, there were 4 teams. Cal was one, UCLA was another, Washington and USC were members of that conference, and they were all paying players to play for their teams. And some were paying a lot more than others. Cal was on the low end of that, but the problem that Cal had was that the famous coach, Pappy Waldorf, was directly involved in these payments. So he was taking the money and he was giving it to the players. And the amount of money, as I recall, something $300,000 to $400,000 or something like that over some period of time. And the other schools, the behavior was more egregious. But Clark Kerr, and I don't know how many of you new students know who Clark Kerr is, but he's probably one of the most important leaders of the 20th century in higher education, and a president, a chancellor here and a president, and the Clark Kerr campus obviously is named after him. But as the chancellor at Berkeley, he publicly censured Pappy Waldorf. And public letter went to the press, etc. And this created, again, a major outcry that Clark Kerr would consider doing something like censoring the famous coach Pappy Waldorf. So this led basically here to the dissolution of the Pacific Coast Conference and what eventually became the Pac-8 over the next several years. So the quick history then at Berkeley is Pacific Coast, the Pac-8 is created by the mid to late 60s. The athletics at Cal at that point in time, because of all the protests and because of major racial issues, some of which occurred on this campus in the late 60s in the basketball program, where there was a major confrontation between the coach and one of our key black players at that point in time. There's a whole history about race and intercollegiate athletics, which you can imagine. It's not a very good history, but so it did not have a big following. Up until about 1960, intercollegiate athletics at Cal was still run by the ASUC, which is interesting. After this scandal in the Pacific Coast Conference is when that changed, so that the administration then took over the management of intercollegiate athletics. It's a very important point here. I should say, because I haven't talked very much about the donors, that when I'm talking about these payments and everything, they're obviously coming from donors and alums who are very committed to their team winning, and winning is a very important part of playing in the United States from the beginning. Trying to adopt this amateur model from Oxford and Cambridge never worked. They're an aristocratic society. We're not. Winning is very important. Okay, that's just a nutshell to talk about that. So let's see. Not a financial problem, however. So intercollegiate athletics was not a financial problem for the campus. 1970, we're in almost, I arrived here in 1972. So Al Bowker is the chancellor at that time. We had a big fight with the NCAA over two athletes, Isaac Curtis and Bromley was the second athlete. These were, Isaac Curtis was the big name. He was a track star and a very good football player. And he did not take one test that the NCAA at that time required. But he was already a student. He was a pretty good student when it became known that he hadn't taken this test. So the NCAA said, he can't play. And the chancellor at that time, Bowker, said that we disagree, and he's going to play. And they said, okay, if you play him, then you're going to lose all the games. All of them will be, whether you win or not, doesn't make any difference. They'll be recorded as a loss for you. And this was leading to a lawsuit that some of the donors were bringing against the NCAA, etc. So Dave Maggart then becomes the AD. Dave was an Olympic athlete, went to Cal, threw the shot, came in 5th in the '68 Olympics, etc. But he becomes AD. And remember now, the involvement of women in sports on this campus happened basically through the Department of Physical Education. That was the level of their involvement. There were some teams, but it was at a very low level. And it was not until 1972 that with passage of Title IX that it gave women standing for institutions that received federal money. So that was the beginning, really. By 1976, we created a Department of Women's Intercollegiate Athletics. The 1970s was also the time when we had the first director of recreational sports program, and he undertook the building of the rec sports building, which I hope all of you use. And there was a lot of competition at that time between these three programs, men's, women's, and rec sports. By this time, Mike Heyman is the chancellor, so we're up into the 1980s. He is not a fan of big-time college sports. He went to Dartmouth and Yale. I I should have mentioned, again, because there's so much material here, but Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the Ivies separate themselves from big-time sports in about 1955. So they move out of this, they de-emphasize sports. It's not so obvious what de-emphasis means because they still spend a lot of money on sports, but they have a different view of it. Under Mike Heyman, there isn't any question about the budget of intercollegiate athletics. They have to meet the bottom line. Not the case for women, but the women's sports were a small program. They had no way to support themselves. They were just beginning to do fundraising, etc. So there was a small deficit that the women carried. Mike Heyman gave this famous speech at the NCAA convention in 1987, questioning all of what was going on. I helped him write that. I was sitting next to him when he got up to give this talk in Dallas, and the NCAA convention is a huge convention. I mean, there's thousands of people that attend this convention. There are only a few cities that can hold such a large convention. And he leaned over to me and he said, "What the hell am I doing? Do I think I'm Don Quixote or something?" Before getting up to give this speech. And then in the Dallas Herald Tribune the next day, in the news section, not in the sports pages, there's a big section, big article in the middle of page 3 with 2 headlines that, "Who is Ira Michael Heyman and who does he think he is?" Okay? that was the reaction, okay, to that speech. So Changlin Tien becomes chancellor in 1990. He's hearing a lot about why doesn't Mike Heyman support sports more, et cetera, et cetera. And so Tien becomes chancellor and he sets up a blue ribbon committee that was chaired by a famous professor on this campus. I was on that committee. Neil, yeah. And anyway, that committee comes out with a statement that kind of shocks me in retrospect, that talks about the fact that athletics should be a broad-based, highly competitive program, and they go into some detail about the fact that that costs money, and they make a recommendation that wouldn't be inappropriate to even put $1 million per year into athletics out of Chancellor's discretionary funds to help them build an endowment. That never happens. The Tien, interestingly, never formally endorses that document. I can't find anything in the record that says thank you very much and we'll do X, Y, and Z. We were in a terrible budget problem in the 90s. It was nowhere near as bad as this, but it was bad. I mean, we lost the number of faculty that we lost during the 1990, 91, 94, through retirements was over 400 faculty at that point in time. And so it had a very major impact. We had a coach, Bruce Snyder at that time, football coach, who was the last successful coach here before Tedford. And Mike Heyman hired him. And in '92, he took us to a bowl game. It was the Citrus Bowl in Florida. And he, at that point, this is '92, Tien was chancellor, he got an offer from Arizona State. We were paying him $250,000 is my recollection. They doubled the salary. So in one of the interviews that I was doing with Bud Scheid, who is a very well-known emeritus faculty member here and dean of he was a vice chancellor during the 60s, he was dean of the business school, very prominent, very smart guy. And he said, "Oh yeah, I remember that." He said, "I got a call from Wally Haas." And Wally Haas, for those of you, I don't know if you know who he is, but he was the chairman of Levi Strauss. He was the owner of the Oakland A's. He was the whole Haas family is just tremendously generous with this university, both athletically and academically. So he calls Bud, and he said, "Bud, I understand that Bruce Snyder may be leaving, and that salary is the issue. And you know, would you convey to the Chancellor for me that you know, I will cover that for him. If he's worried about it, I can, you know, he shouldn't be worried over the salary issue. We can work that out. And so Bud calls Changlin and he says, tells him that. And Tien says, well, I really appreciate his generosity and thank him very much, but I can't have a football coach making more than the highest paid professor on the campus. Okay, so there's a value that at least, and this is kind of my theory, but I think there's a fair amount to it. When you go back to look at Sproul and Kerr, they try to hold the line. They're very upset about the scandal. They talk about de-emphasis. They talk about maybe creating a league, a conference of just California schools, for example. That didn't help with the recruiting of athletes at that point in time, for obvious reasons. And then you have Mike Heyman, who's very clear about the proper role of sports, and Tien. Now, Tien was a big booster at the same time, publicly, so he was the first chancellor, really, to be down on the field, game after game, and everybody loved that. Everybody loved it. But when it came to putting the money into the program, he did not do it. We created 3 women's sports in the 90s when he was chancellor. Lacrosse maybe was right after he left. But he provided only one-time money for those sports, and that's obvious. Obviously, he can't do that, but he didn't have very much money, as I said, because of the financial situation. So these deficits then, as a result of whether that Smelser report really had anything to do with it or not, I don't know, the Blue Ribbon Committee, but these deficits start to grow. So by 96, there are $8 million in deficit total. By 98, that grows to 18. We have another chancellor, Bob Bergdahl, the chancellor at that time, and he forgives that deficit of 18 million, which, you know, I thought everybody knew there was no way they were going to pay that back. I mean, they just didn't have the resources to do it. So that continued to grow over the next, from 98 to 2008, 9, when this erupted. Now, up until 2004, when I had athletics, when it reported to me, and Bob Bergdahl was very insistent about getting this budget under control. There's a whole story there that we don't have time to get into. But I said to him, the only way that we can do this is to make these numbers public. I mean, making the decision on the finance for Intercollegiate Athletics was done by just a very small number. Now, that's not unusual. That happens in probably most institutions. And there's a lot of institutions that subsidize Intercollegiate Athletics. So, and there's a list you can find. Rutgers is at the top of the list this year. They put in $26 million of their own money to subsidize Intercollegiate Athletics when they're laying off staff and faculty. Of course, in 1931, SMU reduced faculty salaries in order to cover the mortgage for the stadium at Southern Methodist University. So again, these issues are not new, all right? And my own view, and I've got to wrap this up, is that they're not going to change. That there will, when we get out of this crisis, and I don't know when that will be, but this crisis is serious enough to lead to some significant change in intercollegiate athletics. But the Pac-10 has now expanded to the Pac-12 and will almost certainly be Pac-16 soon. That's providing a lot of revenue for this program. However, there's a stadium and a high-performance center that has to be paid for, and the financing of that is, questionable. Hopefully it'll work, but if it doesn't, the Regents item says specifically that that's the responsibility of the operating revenues of Intercollegiate Athletics. It makes that very clear. But for the time being, as a result of this Pac-12 expansion and the fact that they were able to raise $20 million to restore the sports that were cut, is going to help the program. And so we'll see. So one of the things that I'm very interested in, and I'd love to talk more about this, is, you know, in my view, your intercollegiate athletics is here to stay. Sperber makes that case right here. They've won the battle. So then you want to do the best that you possibly can with an intercollegiate athletics program. It's very questionable what the tie is between the intercollegiate athletics and academics. And one of the ideas I'm toying around with is, would it be possible to come up with an undergraduate interdisciplinary major? This would not be, you know, for athletes by any means. This would be, in light of all the changes that are going on in our society with regard to health and well-being and concerns about obesity, to actually have an interdisciplinary major that would focus on that, and that would be very substantive, and that could involve all students who are involved in athletics, from rec sports all the way through to the high-performing athletes. They could be subjects for research studies, etc. So anyway, that's a lot of information, Brian.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you. If students need to leave for another class, feel free to do that. We'll just take a couple of minutes for questions for those who remain, and Professor Tabor is the first one.
I have to ask this question.